That Tuesday, when I first realized my life was a masterfully constructed facade, a cold, wet snow was falling over Chicago. I stood by the glass doors of my own office, watching my wife Sarah gently adjust the scarf on the neck of my best friend Mark, right there in the parking lot under a flickering streetlight. It didn't look like a casual encounter or a polite gesture. There was such a familiar, mundane tenderness in the way she pressed her palms against his chest that something inside me simply snapped. I was holding a gift bag for our anniversary, and I felt the sharp cardboard corner dig into my palm, but I barely felt the pain, only a bone-chilling cold. At that moment, I didn't yet know that this evening was just the first page of a script they had been writing for me for years, and that the ultimate truth waiting at the end would make me regret ever opening those doors. Mark and I had been inseparable since college. We had clawed our way through student jobs, our first failed startups, and long, sleepless nights when we shared a single cold pizza and a dream of building something real. When I met Sarah, it was Mark who pushed me to propose. He was my best man, the one who held my trembling hands while we waited for our daughter to be born. I trusted him more than I trusted myself. I knew his banking passwords, he knew all my deepest fears. And now, watching them through the fogged glass, I saw Mark lean in and kiss her, not on the cheek, but right on the corner of her lips, and she didn't pull away. She stood frozen for a beat, and then laughed with that same quiet, special laugh that I thought was meant only for me. I slowly stepped back into the shadows of the hallway, my heart hammering in my throat like a trapped bird. I wanted to run out, to scream, to demand answers, but the rational part of my brain, the one that had helped me run a successful business for years, ordered me to stay still. I went back to my office, sank into my leather chair, and felt a total sense of disorientation for the first time in years. What if our entire life, those shared vacations, those nights the four of us played board games, those conversations about growing old together, was just one long, carefully orchestrated act of deception? I started replaying the last 6 months in my head. Why had Sarah suddenly started staying late for evening design courses? Why had Mark lately been advising me to slow down and take vacations alone, without him? My phone on the desk buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Honey, I'll be a little late. Mark is dropping off the documents you asked for. Don't wait for dinner. Order something for yourself." It was so brazen, so predictable, that I felt the shock give way to something else, a cold, viscous rage. I knew they were about to get on the elevator, that they would walk into this office, and I would be forced to pretend I hadn't seen a thing. I glanced at the security camera hidden in the corner of the ceiling. I had installed it myself when there were petty thefts in the office, but I never thought the footage would be needed for something like this. I stood up, walked over to the monitor, and pulled up the archive from the last few hours. I didn't know what I hoped to see, but what I saw on the screen as they entered the building 10 minutes ago made me completely question my own sanity. Mark wasn't just guiding her by the arm, he had handed her something, an envelope, and she had tucked it into her purse with the look of someone holding the key to my entire world. They walked into the office. Mark was wearing his usual broad smile, and Sarah looked slightly flushed. "Hi, honey," she said, walking over to kiss my cheek. "Are you still here?" I smelled her perfume mingled with the faint scent of his cologne that had clung to her outside. I looked them both in the eye and asked, "Mark, did you bring what I asked for?" He nodded, not breaking my gaze. "Of course, buddy. Everything is ready." But in his eyes, those familiar eyes, I suddenly saw something alien, something that had never been my friend. Everything is ready, Mark repeated, his voice dropping into that smooth, professional tone he used for clients. He placed a heavy, cream-colored envelope on my desk, the very same one I'd seen him pass to Sarah on the security footage. My pulse was a frantic drumbeat in my ears, but I managed to keep my hands steady. I looked from the envelope to Sarah, who was busy taking off her coat, her movements just a little too fluid, a little too careful. "Thanks, Mark," I said, forcing a smile that felt like cracked glass. "I appreciate you driving out this late. Why don't you stick around? We have some leftover wine, and I think we need to talk about the Q3 projections anyway." I watched them both freeze. It was a microsecond, a flicker of genuine panic in Mark's eyes that he masked almost instantly with a shrug. Sarah, however, turned a shade paler. "Actually, honey, Mark has an early start tomorrow, and I am pretty exhausted myself. Maybe we can do it another time?" "Another time," I repeated, tasting the bitterness of the words. "Right, another time." I didn't let them leave immediately. I kept them there for 20 minutes, forcing small talk about the housing market and our daughter's upcoming school play. It was a torture of my own design. I watched every nervous tick, every time Mark checked his watch, every time Sarah glanced toward the door. I was learning a new language, the language of their betrayal. Every time they looked at each other, there was a silent, frantic communication, a desperate need to know if I knew. When they finally left, the silence that fell over the office wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. I opened the envelope. It wasn't the documents for the merger I had expected. It was a stack of property deeds and bank statements, all registered under an offshore holding company, a company I had never heard of, but whose signature authority was listed as Sarah. My blood ran cold as I scanned the numbers. It wasn't just an affair. They were systematically draining every asset I had spent 15 years building. They were preparing to leave me with nothing but the debts. I spent that night in the office, unable to go home to the house that now felt like a prison. By 3 a.m., I had pieced together enough to see the trap. They hadn't just been stealing money, they had been planting evidence of my own irregularities in the company's internal accounting. If I tried to confront them, they had a narrative ready. The stressed, paranoid husband who'd gone off the deep end and started embezzling from his own company. The next morning, I arrived home at dawn. The house was quiet, too quiet. I walked into the kitchen, and there was Sarah, sitting at the breakfast table, a cup of coffee in her hand. She looked up, and for a split second, I didn't see the woman I'd loved. I saw a stranger, a predator. "You didn't come home," she said, her voice calm, devoid of any real concern. "I found the envelope, Sarah," I replied, placing it on the table. She didn't flinch. She just set her coffee cup down and stared at me, her expression shifting from feigned surprise to a cold, calculated boredom. "Well," she sighed, checking her nails, "I suppose it's better this way. We were going to tell you eventually. You're just too dense to see what's staring you in the face." The casual cruelty of her words hit harder than any slap. "How long?" I whispered. "Does it matter?" she asked, rising from her chair and walking toward me. She stopped inches away, her eyes devoid of heat. "You've been married to your career for years. Mark was the one who was actually there when I needed to talk. Mark was the one who actually saw me. You just saw a trophy, a partner, a mother for your child. You never saw me." I felt the ground beneath me vanish. I realized then that I wasn't just losing my wife and my best friend. I was losing the reality of my own past. Every memory I cherished, every struggle we'd shared, was being rewritten in front of my eyes. "I'm going to ruin you both," I said, my voice barely audible. Sarah laughed, a cold, sharp sound. "With what money?" With what reputation? You're already a ghost, darling. By the time the board meeting happens on Monday, you won't even be the owner of this kitchen. She walked past me, grabbing her purse, leaving me standing in the center of a life that was rapidly unraveling into ashes. I had reached the point where I thought I had lost everything, but as I stood there, I realized the worst part wasn't the money or the betrayal. It was the fact that I had been blind for so long. But I had one card left, one thing they didn't know I had. And as the front door clicked shut behind her, a new, dark resolve began to harden in my chest. I wasn't going to go down quietly. The house felt like a tomb. I spent the next 48 hours in a haze of caffeine and cold, calculated rage, not sleeping, not eating, just staring at the glow of my laptop screen. Sarah was right. On paper, I was already a ghost. They had spent months fabricating a digital trail that made it look like I was siphoning company funds into private offshore accounts. To the board, to the investors, and even to the authorities, I was the one who had cracked under the pressure of the merger. But they had made one fatal mistake. They were so focused on the money that they had forgotten about the legacy. They had forgotten that I was the one who originally designed the security architecture of our servers. They had forgotten about the backdoor logs that tracked every single keystroke, every file transfer, and every message sent between their private devices. Logs that were encrypted on a server in a jurisdiction they couldn't even name, let alone hack. On Monday morning, I walked into the boardroom at 9 a.m. sharp. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Mark sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of simulated concern. Sarah sat to his right, wearing a sharp navy suit that I had bought her for our anniversary. A sick twist of irony. When I entered, the chatter died instantly. "I think there's been a mistake," I said, my voice steady, ringing clearly against the mahogany table. I didn't sit down. I walked to the head of the projector, plugged in my drive, and stood there for a heartbeat, watching the color drain from Mark's face. He knew. He realized that I hadn't spent the weekend crying or calling lawyers. I had spent it gathering the receipts. "I've spent the last 48 hours auditing our internal communications," I began, looking directly at the chairman of the board. "It seems we've had a severe breach of fiduciary duty. Not by me, but by the two people I trusted most with my life." I clicked the remote. The screen flickered to life. It wasn't just bank statements, it was their private chat logs, their emails detailing the plan to tank the company's valuation to buy me out for pennies, and, most damning of all, recorded audio of them discussing their future once I was ruined. Sarah let out a strangled gasp and Mark lunged toward me, but he was held back by the company's security detail. The room erupted. It was total chaos, but for the first time in weeks, the silence in my own head was replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I didn't yell, I didn't plead, I simply watched as their entire world, the status, the power, the new life they had built on the foundation of my betrayal, crumbled in real time. The police were called, not by me, but by the board members themselves who were already distancing themselves from the scandal. As they were escorted out of the building in handcuffs, Mark looked back at me. He didn't look angry. He looked hollow. Sarah didn't even look up. She kept her head down, her carefully curated persona finally stripped bare, showing the woman I had never truly known. I won. That's what people would say. I kept the company. I kept my reputation, and I saved my future. But as I sat in that boardroom an hour later, staring at the empty chairs, the victory felt like ashes in my mouth. I had defeated the villains, but the cost was the realization that the last 15 years of my life were built on a foundation of sand. I wasn't the victim who had been saved. I was the man who had wasted his life loving a mirage. I walked out of the office into the bright, biting Chicago afternoon. I didn't head home. I didn't check my phone. I stood on the sidewalk, took a deep breath of the freezing air, and for the first time in 35 years, I felt absolutely nothing. The betrayal had taken everything, including the person I used to be. And as I turned the corner and started walking, not knowing where I was going, I realized that the greatest freedom wasn't proving them wrong. It was the ability to finally start a life that was entirely, irrevocably my own. One where I didn't have to look over my shoulder, and where I finally learned the hardest lesson of all. Trust isn't a gift you give to others. It's a promise you keep to yourself.